All right, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming and taking time out of your day. My name's Molly Moorhead. I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. So yeah, and this is mortality composting for livestock and pets with Dr. Amy Schmidt. I'm so glad you all could make it. Just a couple of housekeeping tips before, rather things to go over before we get started. Your cameras will stay off and you'll be muted throughout the presentation. So please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll answer those at some point during the presentation or after. This presentation will be recorded and uploaded to Conservation Nebraska's YouTube within the next couple of weeks. So if you miss any part of the presentation or would like to revisit it or share it with any of your friends, you'll be able to find it there, along with all of our other, backlog of webinars. And also following the presentation, we'll have a very brief survey that should only take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill these out. If anyone in attendance is interested in speaking with a Conservation Nebraska member regarding conservation issues in Nebraska, or to find out more about what we do, I'll put our email in the chat. So tonight, we welcome Dr. Amy Schmidt from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who's going to speak with us about mortality composting for livestock and pets. And she'll tell you a little bit more about her work and where she's coming from, and then go right into our topic. So I'll turn it over to her. Thanks so much, Amy. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Well, I'm happy to be here. I cannot see all of you, so I hope you will ask questions and engage with me during the talk, so that I make sure that I address topics that are of interest to you or questions that are of interest to you. Um, so my background, I've been here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for about 14 years. I'm a faculty member in biological systems engineering and animal science, and my responsibilities fall under research and extension. So as far as mortality management and mortality composting, I've really primarily worked in the livestock arena with that. So it's pretty common with livestock to compost mortalities on the farm. And but the reality is we can compost anything that's organic. So today I'm going to talk through kind of some examples. Try to keep it kind of high level, but I do encourage you to ask specific questions if I'm not getting into some of the details that you might be interested in. Um, but I've been in academia in the engineering and livestock manure management and mortality management field for I guess it's 27 years now. So this has been what I do for a very long time, and happy to be here to talk to you all about it and to share any insight that I can if this is something you're interested in. All right. Um, So the challenge really is whether we're talking about a large animal feeding operation with hundreds or even thousands of cattle or pigs, or we're talking about companion animals, pets and horses and animals that we keep more as companions than as food animals. We want to make sure that they're safely handled when we lose that animal, so that we're protecting the health of other animals, the health of humans. We're protecting water quality. So that safe disposal is really the challenge that we're talking about this evening. So, like I said, we can, we have dealt with mortality management in livestock systems for as long as we've raised livestock. It's natural that you have some loss of animals due to disease um, or other issues, just like we have a normal mortality level in people. We have that in animals as well. But we can also kind of expand that to a lot of different areas. So, states, our Department of Transportation, they're collecting roadkill. Uh, they could take that to a landfill. It might be composted. They might have a burial site, or they might just move it off of the road and kind of out of sight. But that's something that has to be dealt with and disposed of. Unfortunately, we lose pets, and we have to figure out um, do we bury them ourselves? Do we want to compost them? Do we take them to someone who will do cremation? So it's a good thing to think about ahead of time, especially with pets, because it's hard to make that decision when you're in that situation where you have an animal that you've lost. We have a lot of backyard poultry in Nebraska, particularly in our Omaha and Lincoln areas. And so that's another opportunity for managing uh, a mortality on within your own yard, and rather than trying to figure out where to dispose of that, it's definitely possible to compost on site there. And one that I've gotten calls about every so often are horses, where someone says, my horse is getting very old. I know I'm going to have it put down. Um, I don't know what to do with it after that happens. That's a pretty large animal. So we can compost horses. For the most part, I find that people don't want me to tell them how to do it. They would rather have someone do that for them, which is totally understandable when you have kind of that emotional connection to an animal. So we'll talk more about that here in a bit. Um, but generally, what is composting? Any organic material, whether it is plant material or animals, it's going to decompose when it's no longer living. It's made up of organic matter. It's got different nutrients in it. Our bodies, we have proteins and phosphorus and calcium in our bodies. And composting is sort of an accelerated and controlled decomposition process. So what we're looking at is we build this environment where microorganisms can feed on the carbon and organic material in that pile. And when they're doing that, they're releasing um, carbon dioxide and they're generating heat. And so we get that heating that we are looking for that gets up to temperatures where we can kill pathogens and effectively break down the materials that are in that compost pile. So it's just a way of having a more controlled method. And when we think about livestock systems in particular, um, we want to be sure that what we're doing is biosecure, that we're disposing of animals in a way that if they died of a disease, we're not we're not transmitting, leaving that disease to be transmitted to other animals. So in those cases, we want to reach certain temperatures that kill those pathogens, if that's what caused that mortality in the first place. So we'll talk about temperatures and all of that here in a bit as well. But that's generally when we talk about composting, is just a controlled decomposition. What can we compost? Literally anything that is carbon based. A lot of people compost food waste. We've heard of, paper products that can be composted. There's people in the state who commingle food waste with animal waste and cardboard, waste cardboard. Any of those products that are a carbon base can be composted alone or in combination with other products. So it's really no limit to what we can compost as long as it was once a living organism. Let's talk about benefits of composting. Again, I kind of have to separate a livestock system from more of a household system or companion animal system. When we think about livestock, um, there's 5 ways that the state of Nebraska will allow farmers to dispose of dead animals on a farm. They can compost those animals. They can send them to a rendering facility. They can be sent to a landfill. They can be buried, or they could be incinerated. Um, what we have found over the years is that the availability of rendering facilities for livestock, um, they're getting to be fewer and farther between. So the cost of having someone come and pick up those animals to take to rendering is getting to be a challenge. Um, so that on-farm disposal, we are basically looking at burial or composting or incineration. And incineration is tends to be fairly expensive. And there's some air quality issues related to that. You're generating exhaust from that system. And so not a lot of our farmers maintain the equipment they need to do incineration. In companion animals, we would call it cremation. So a lot of people I know will have pets cremated when they die. And so similar processes, but we call them different things based on the industry we're talking about. Um, One of the benefits of composting is we're recycling the nutrients in that item or items that we're composting. So rather than sending food waste to a landfill, we compost it, we break it down, and we are basically recovering nutrients that we can then use to fertilize land um, and improve soil quality. Same is true when we compost animals. There's a little bit more involved as far as, um, sometimes bones don't fully break down, but in the end, you shouldn't be able to tell what was composted. Every bit of compost should look the same. So we've fully broken everything down, and what we have is organic matter with some nutrients. Um, as far as comparing to burial, composting can be done year round. Burial tends to be more difficult in the winter months because we have frozen soils. We maybe can't dig in the soil to bury animals. Um, Even in pretty cold weather, we can get a compost system to start heating up if it's built correctly. So um, we also know that when animals decompose, there's quite a bit of liquid or leachate, we call it, that's formed. And so we need to think about what type of soil do we have? How deep is our water table? Or depth to groundwater. Those are things to think about as far as, do we bury an animal if we have a very high water table. If we have a heavy clay soil, I don't really worry about that liquid leaching through the soil, but um, it can be um, it can be a more environmentally sound option than burial in some locations in the state. Um, and then again, biosecurity, if we don't have to take animals from the farm to a rendering facility or a landfill, that if those animals have died of a disease, it's more biosecure to dispose of them on farm. That way we don't risk transmitting that disease to other animals along the way from our farm to that rendering facility or landfill. So also, there's some barriers to composting. I think the two biggest barriers, one is that it's it's a natural process. We can come up with recipes and I can tell you how to do it, but there's a lot of just trial and error involved. And I've built compost piles that didn't perform the way they should have, and then I have to troubleshoot, is there too much carbon? Is there too much nitrogen? Is it not enough moisture? um, not enough cover on the pile to insulate it. So it does require time and attention. It's not something where you can throw things in a pile and come back 6 months later and have a beautiful compost product that you can use on your garden or on a field. It does require time and attention and a dedication to troubleshooting and getting it just right. And then with companion animals, I think that emotional attachment can definitely make it more difficult. Like I said, I've had horse owners ask, could you compost a horse for me? Because they don't want to do that themselves. And right now, as far as I know, there's not a service in the state that would accept companion animals for composting in a case like that. So, um, other barriers, kind of if you're looking at a large farm versus a household, there's equipment needs, the amount of materials needed and the space needed can be barriers. But in general, I think the two biggest are it takes a lot of time and attention and dedication and that emotional attachment. And one thing I will say, a lot of folks don't think about that emotional attachment with livestock and farm animals. Um, We've had situations during COVID where supply chain disruptions led to not having capacity at packing plants for animals to be taken in for processing. And if you're familiar with the ag industry at all, you know that it works, it's like clockwork. Like when animals are to the point where they need to go to the packing plant, there's animals coming into that building behind them. So you don't really have the option of just saying, we'll just hold on to them for another 4 weeks until the plants are open. So we see cases like that where a farmer has to euthanize animals and dispose of them, and that's not easy for them. That's their livelihood. We don't always think about that emotional impact on farmers because we think, well, it's just their livestock, no big deal. But it's difficult, even in that situation where you have several hundred animals versus maybe just one or two companion animals.
Can I ask a question, Amy?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is great so far. Thank you so much. Uh, I know some farmers will just like drag an animal to like kind of a more remote part of their property and leave it there. And like in a really sparsely populated area, that seems like that might work. Is that question A, like what are your thoughts about that? And then B, like is that like a legal way to do it?
Yeah, it's not a legal way to dispose of livestock. Um, like I said, we can bury, incinerate, compost, render, or landfill. So just dragging it out, into the timber in the back 40 or whatever, that's not really an acceptable option. Now, it's done a lot. I remember growing up, that's what my grandpa did with livestock. And the risks that you have there are, is the liquid that's generated going to get into a water body and contaminate that water. You'll have wild animals that are going to be attracted to that. And, if there was a disease that caused that animal's death, there's that opportunity for transmitting the disease by animals that are moving around. So, and then odor. So it's just really, it's not an acceptable method. Can't say that it doesn't still happen, but, like I mentioned with roadkill, those animals may not be, buried or composted. Um, so yeah, it's not ideal in a animal feeding operation that's not legal, but we have animals die in nature and they're not buried or composted, and um, that's not a controlled situation either. So for the most part, if it's
Yeah.
not a large volume of animals, um, I don't
Right.
I don't think it's probably a big concern. But if those animals are managed, they should be disposed of correctly.
There's actually a few questions in the chat, but I think some of them maybe we should hold off, but there's one that maybe is a good moment. Um, if I may.
Absolutely.
Would someone need a permit for providing something like that for others than their own animals? So I think for composting, animals in general?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the county that you're in, whether they will allow you to, whether their zoning regulations allow for um, composting of. So on an animal feeding operation, you're allowed to compost regardless of where you're located because that's um, you have that requirement to dispose of animals safely within 24 to 36 hours of them dying. You can compost your own animals at home. Um, but as far as operating a facility where you accept livestock, companion animals, or other animals for composting, I really think it's county specific in terms of what they will allow you to do. From the perspective of our Nebraska Department of Agriculture, they have they are fine with a person operating a mortality composting facility as long as they're doing it according to regulatory standards and they're managing things correctly.
Thank you. I'll let you keep talking.
Okay. Um, so one of the things we need to think about if we want to compost, and this is true for mortalities or just for yard waste and food waste, whatever product it is, we want to choose a spot um, that is away from surface water. We don't want to put them in low-lying areas where water is going to run down and pond around that compost pile. We want to make sure it's accessible, whether that's for equipment in the setting of an animal feeding operation, some larger pieces of equipment, or just at our household, having it be where we can get to it and check the temperature of the pile and make sure things are operating correctly. But we also want it to be discreet. Um, it's not something most people want to see if they don't have to. And I think it's important to consider the location of neighbors. And so we do have setback requirements for livestock mortality disposal. Those don't really exist for individual um, homes and those landowners. Um, but I think common sense is typically what I would ask people to employ there. Um, you're not going to put it at the edge of your property next to your neighbor um, if it's closer to their house than it is to yours. If you're putting it so far away, you don't want to smell it if it has a bad odor. They don't want to either. So I think that's important to remember. I wouldn't place them near a well if you have well water on your site. Um, Stay 100, 200 feet back from that well. Um, like I mentioned, if your water table, you need to kind of understand how your water table sits and the porosity of your soil to know, is it okay to bury something, 24 inches deep? Do I have plenty of space between the bottom of that burial pit and or that compost site and groundwater that I don't risk that contamination of groundwater from leaching um, nutrients into the soil. So kind of, I think kind of common sense of putting it where it's not real visible, but it's you're able to manage it and keep an eye on it and avoid placing them near any water bodies that we don't want to contaminate. Um, I did include here, so this is the livestock regulation um, for routine mortality. Um, and non-disease related mass mortality. So when we think of, so routine is, what you deal with on a daily or weekly or monthly basis of loss of animals on a farm. Non-disease related mass mortality events, we have unfortunately a very good example of that right now with the fires out in western Nebraska. Livestock have been lost due to fires. So that is, you could have major losses that are not caused by a disease. So tornadoes, flooding, blizzards where animals can't get to water or the water's frozen, um, extreme heat that causes death in cattle often. Those are all situations where you could have more than your typical amount of mortalities, but it's not related to a disease. Um, when there's a disease, then there's usually some special circumstances that the Department of Ag um, will dictate how those are disposed of. We talk a lot of in the industry about being prepared for foreign animal disease and what happens if you lose animals to a foreign animal disease, and so there's a lot more restrictions in that situation. But so this document, there's a URL that you can go read it if you're interested, particularly if you are a livestock farmer. And then the QR code should also take you to that document online. So um, I just thought I would share that as a resource for those that are interested. Another thing you want to think about is you will likely need to add water to that compost system. On the eastern side of the state, we get sufficient rainfall usually. It's dry right now. If you had a compost pile right now, you would probably need to add some water to it. It would be too dry for the biological processes to be happening that you need. Um, so you want to have access to water. And then, like I say, avoid putting it closer to someone else's house than you put it to your own. Um, in the manure field where I work, a lot of my time I call it minding your manure manners. So it's just doing the things that we know we should do, the common sense things to keep our neighbors happy and to protect our natural resources. So in general, there's a couple of composting methods. Um, Bin composting or compost bin on the right, that's much more common in a residential setting, an urban setting, where you sort of have a structure where you can pile that material, you can turn it, you can mix it in that, and it's not a huge compost pile. Windrow composting on the left, that's quite a bit more common in livestock systems or large municipal composting systems. And what that means is it's done on the ground. If it's mortalities, you're going to build a section of pile for the mortalities you have, and then as you add more, you just extend the length of that windrow. So you just end up growing the size of that compost windrow, but you always follow the basics of having dry material as bedding, below it as a base, animals placed on it, and then covered up, and then continue that kind of down the line until till you run out of length, and then you might start a second windrow next to it. Um, so those are, within those systems, there are situations where we might aerate, force air through there to help with the composting process. The number of times we turn it might be different depending on what we're looking at as a final product. But generally, you're either going to have it on the ground as a windrow or you're going to have it in some um, formed pile or within some sort of bin um, to keep it contained in smaller cases. So this is just an example of, particularly for livestock farming, you don't necessarily have to build a structure to do bin composting. This is an example of using round bales to kind of form your compost bins. And the idea being this primary bin, I'm going to start here with putting my animals in it until I have um, reached the capacity that it can hold. And then I'm going to stop adding animals and I'm going to leave that sit for 3 months, whatever it needs to sit for those animals to compost. And then after that time, I'm going to turn that and I'm going to move it into the secondary bin where I let it continue to compost. And so you design these kind of so that you continuously are filling a bin. Um, and when that one's full, you move to another one. And when that second one's full, now the first one you're ready to move into a secondary composting state. So it's just sort of a kind of a clockwork um, design that you set up. And then you might have space for some of that carbon material that you're going to use. So that's a very simple, I guess, design of bin composting. And I apologize, these pictures are not looking very clear. But this is an actual structure for bin composting where you see that you have three sides that are concrete, so you're able to access from the front and add animals um, and material in there. And then when that's full, you're going to let it sit and finish composting before you empty it and turn it and put it into another bin. Windrow compost, like I said, you're basically kind of building long rows of compost material. This picture on the right is actually some composting we've done at one of our research farms where we had, you have one animal that you put in a pile here, and a couple days later, there's another one. So you can kind of see where we've added on to that pile each time there were more animals. And so as you go down the row, whoops, um, as you go down the row, they're at different stages of decomposition in there. And then at some point, we'd come back and turn that whole pile to get it reintroduce oxygen and start the composting, the heating process again. So just a couple different methods that are typical for farming systems. Oh, I don't know how that happened. Let's see here. Okay, so let's talk about the basics of building a compost pile. Doesn't really matter what you're composting or whether it's a large scale system or a small backyard system. We always want to start with a foundation of some dry carbon material. Um, you could probably get away with less if you're doing, yard waste composting and, food scraps, that sort of thing. But with mortalities, we want to start with 2 feet in depth, our carbon material. And I'll talk about some different carbon materials here in a moment. But basically, we want a thick pad of dry material that is large enough that when we place our animals on it, there's space around those animals, at least 24 inches around those animals, before you get to the edge of that pile, that base. And so when we build that base, we can use again, any kind of carbon material. We want it to be a dry material because we want it to be able to absorb liquid that is generated during that composting process. Um, we use wood chips a lot in livestock composting because they're plentiful. We can usually get our hands on wood chips. Wood shavings are really ideal, but we don't have a lot of woodworking industry in the state that produces these high quality wood shavings. Now, if you have small livestock system, maybe you have some show animals for 4-H, or you have a couple of horses that are in stalls where you're adding bedding. That material is fantastic for composting just on its own, that bedding mixed with manure. But it's also a good product for if you are composting animals to put that material around them because that carbon nitrogen ratio is usually pretty ideal to get the organisms working in there and doing their part to break down that organic material. Crop residue, corn stalks, hay bales, any of those products we can use for composting. Maybe a little bit different management based on how dense those products are. Maybe you have to mix a couple different carbon sources together to get enough. But if it's a dry carbon source, we can usually make it work for composting. So this is an example of a study my group did, and it's kind of just showing the schematic of how we laid it out. But we were looking at different compost methods and trying to measure temperature within those piles, see that we're meeting temperatures for destroying disease-causing organisms. And in this case, we had, I think it was 22 pigs that were in each of our compost units. We don't leave a lot of space between the animals. We're going to just kind of, not necessarily pile on top of each other, but kind of keep them close together. And in this case, our base was 15 feet by 22 feet. We put 22 animals in there side by side. And then showing here, we left that space around the edge. We don't want the animals right out to the edge of that pad. And the reason is when we cover all that up, we want to make sure that there's no parts of that animal that are poking out of the pile or that are not buried very deep in the pile, because then we risk attracting scavenging animals to that area. So um, build the pad, make sure it's large enough for all of your animals, and you can leave that barrier around the edge. And and then we're going to go on with our next stage of covering that pile. So in this picture, just looking at a couple of chickens. So we've got our base material. We put our chickens in the center of it. If we're looking at a commercial operation, usually we can build that pile in layers with small animals like chickens. So you might do a base with some chickens, some more carbon material, some chickens. But with larger animals, we're usually just a single layer of those larger animals. But in this case, we place the chickens in the center of that base that we've built. Um, and then the next stage, we're going to cover that material, not with a dry carbon, but a moistened carbon. If you have access to old compost or like finished compost that you've been using, that's great. It's got carbon, it's got nitrogen, usually has some moisture, and it's uh, microbes are gonna and they're gonna like that material. Um, when we talk about wetting that material down, that's a really it's difficult to think about. We usually say 40 to 60% moisture content. Well, what does that look like? If you can pick up that material and squeeze it and it clumps up, so it's wet enough to cause, to kind of clump together, but it's not dripping water out of it, you probably have a pretty good moisture content there. So again, this is a kind of a trial and error process, but we want this to have not just carbon, but some nitrogen, because that carbon and nitrogen together is what produces uh, allows the microorganisms to consume that carbon material, nitrogen material, and produce the heat that we want to see with composting. And then we're going to come back after that and we're going to cover that all up with dry material. So this is sort of our cap or envelope, we would call it. And what we want to ensure is that no parts, no hooves or feet are sticking out of it here. We've got it covered well enough that it's insulated. The odor should be minimal coming from that if it was built correctly. Um, but those are kind of the layers of that pile that we're going for. So how long does it take to compost animals of different sizes? Small animals like poultry or some household pets probably are going to compost fairly quickly if that pile is built right and it's managed right. So a couple weeks, maybe a month. Um, as you get larger, it takes a little bit longer to do that. So, beef cattle and dairy cattle, we're probably going to compost for 4 to 6 months before we would then turn that pile and reestablish it to start a second heating cycle. Um, but it depends on how many the volume of carcasses in there and the conditions. So anywhere from a few weeks to several months. Some of the basics, like I said, 40 to 60% moisture is what we're looking for, kind of that wet sponge um, consistency. It's good to have a temperature probe so that you can measure the temperature inside that pile. We're looking to get up to 130 to 145 degrees Fahrenheit for several days. Um, if we're not getting those temperatures, we probably need to troubleshoot. Do we not have enough moisture? Do we have too much moisture? What's off that's not allowing that heating to take place? Um, Carbon nitrogen ratio, again, this is when it's easy to give a number, but it's hard to really visualize that. So I've got a slide next that shows what are the carbon nitrogen ratios of different materials that we might use. And then porosity, we want we want oxygen to be able to get in there so that the microbes have that oxygen so that they can survive. But but we also want it dense enough that we're not letting the heat escape from that system. So it's kind of a fine line there where we don't want it too dense, but we don't want it too porous either. So this is just kind of an example, some different materials. Like I said, if you have manure or you have like here horse manure, if it's mixed with bedding, you got a pretty good carbon nitrogen ratio naturally there. You look over here, wood chips, they're very high in carbon, very low in nitrogen. So you need to add some nitrogen in that system. Otherwise, that carbon material is probably, it's going to take a long time to break down if you don't have that nitrogen added to it. So I don't really have a good magic way of coming up with a recipe. I always try to, but it really comes down to trial and error, I think, depending on the materials that you have available. Um, Once the temperature of that pile falls, that means that those microbes don't have any food left, or they don't have any oxygen left. So we need to turn that pile. That introduces some of the carbon and organic matter that hasn't been broken down, reintroduces that to the organisms so they have a food source again, introduces some oxygen, and those microbes should come back alive and start generating heat and decomposing that material like they were before. Again, a lot of trial and error, just kind of troubleshooting. If it's too wet, you may need to add some carbon material to balance out that moisture. If it's too dry, you may need to add some moisture to the system. Um, and so multiple times of turning it, when it stops heating after you've turned it, then we know that it's done. We've reached a point where there's no more available organic material for the organisms to break down and use as their food source. Um, so this last slide, I just thought I would show some general nutrient properties of compost. I think the takeaway is whatever that product started as, when you get to the end, you will still have some nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but most of your nitrogen is tied up in the organic form. So if you think about fertilizing your garden, compost is great for building the structure of your soil and improving your soil properties. It's not adding a lot of available nitrogen to the system because that nitrogen is tied up in the organic material and it won't become available for a long time as the soil microorganisms break that down. So composting is generally not a good source of available nitrogen right away, but it is a good source of organic nitrogen and just organic material, which is important to helping improve the structure of soil. So that's what I have prepared. I'm happy to talk other subjects if there's something I didn't cover that you're more interested in. But not knowing the variety of interests we might have on the webinar, I wanted to make sure I kept it fairly high level. So I will turn it back over to you, Molly, if there's some questions or comments.
Yeah, your timing was impeccable.
I was watching my clock up there, so I knew when to stop
Um,
rambling.
Thank you so much. That's amazing. So, we have a few questions in the chat, and I'll invite anyone
Okay.
else to add some. And I'll just also, I'm going to take this moment to launch our survey,
Okay.
so that folks can have a minute to, here we go. It'll just pop up for you guys. If everyone can fill that out, it's super helpful. So we have a good question at the beginning. Uh, can we touch on the long-term issues with euthanol, if there are any?
Say that again.
Do you have any information or thoughts about issues with euthanol, so the drug they use in euthanasia? So that
Yes.
being like in the animal's body.
So there's research, particularly with equine, when those animals are given, if there's a chemical used to euthanize them. Those chemicals tend to not break down um, quickly, but over time they will, and usually they're in a small enough concentration that we're not really worried about them moving in the environment. But if you had a situation where you used pentobarbital or something to euthanize a lot of animals, I think you would want to be really certain that your compost system is operating as efficiently as you'd like. So you are getting that decomposition that you want. And you'd probably want to compost it longer than normal. And I would recommend sampling and having it tested before it's used for land application, just to ensure that you don't have any harmful chemicals left in it. But for the most part, look, you think about pets, they're small enough, there's not going to be a large concentration of a chemical if you were to compost them. And then most livestock um, are not being euthanized with chemicals, or you have a large mortality event because of weather or disease. Those animals are not we're not giving an injection of any sort to euthanize the animals, so it's not necessarily a concern there.
You touched on this. So we've got like the Q&A and we've got the chat. So in the Q&A, which I
Okay.
hadn't seen yet, someone was actually specifically asking about sodium pentobarbital. So you just answered that. So that it just like from your perspective, it's like you want to be conscientious of that and give more time to break it down.
Right. And then, sample it at some point to see if there's drug residue left in it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Especially if you're dealing with like a larger amount, right? I mean,
Yeah.
a larger
And
amount of
if the
animals. Yeah.
person asking the question wants some actual data on that, I can share some papers um, of research that was specifically done on uh, pentobarbital breakdown or how long that residue remains in
Oh,
mortality
that's great.
compost.
That's great. Yeah. And so if that was you, it was anonymous, but if that was you, feel free to email any of us, info at anyconserve.org, or you can, it looks like oh yeah, you've got your email right there,
Yeah.
Schmidt at unl.edu. Um, so that's great. So oh, someone also asked who can test for that? So like if you needed it to be tested.
You're probably going to have to take it to a vet diagnostic laboratory. Like we have the vet diagnostic clinic on campus here, or any other vet programs if you're not in Nebraska. They would probably be able to do that sort of test for you. It's probably going to be fairly expensive to do a chemical test like that. But if you know, I know when we do composting of plant materials that might have aflatoxin or pesticide, herbicides in them. And we want to make sure that applying that to land won't harm the plants that we're growing on that land. The only way to figure that out is to take a sample and send it to a testing lab. So probably a vet diagnostic lab or something like Midwest Labs in Omaha. They could do that sort of analysis on a sample.
Well, thank you.
Mhm.
Uh, what should we do if we find birds of prey deceased along the roadways?
Um, I'd probably leave them alone. Um, I think, you know, with avian influenza being such a risk right now, you know, the risk there is that birds can carry avian influenza but not be sickened by it, whereas our poultry can be. So if you have migratory birds, and this is a tough time of the year with migration of waterfowl and with birds, um, I would say if there's a large quantity of birds that you're finding dead, there's something going on there that's causing that. If it's not a large amount, it's probably something natural or a predator or being hit by a car, something like that, I probably wouldn't worry about it as much. Um, we're mainly, you know, the main concern there is if there's a large volume of them, we want to dispose of properly. And if there is a large volume, there's probably some disease aspect that needs to be investigated. So I would probably notify the state veterinary office in the Department of Ag and just say, there's an unusually large amount of whatever birds in this area. You may want to check that out. But for your less common, is hit by a car sort of thing, probably not a large enough volume to really cause a concern.
I always just, if it's near my property, I bury them. Would you say that that's
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah. I mean, if it's on
Just
your
keeping
property,
some
like,
things in
yeah,
mind.
I would either, you can put it in your trash if you have your trash picked up, or you can bury it or throw it in a compost pile, something like that. But yeah, um, definitely if it's on your property. And if you have pets or kids that are out, running around, you just kind of want to get rid of it, then putting it in the garbage or burying it or composting would be acceptable.
I'm gonna end the poll in a minute. If anyone, we still have a few people who haven't filled it out yet. It's true, I can see that. So if anyone still wants to fill it out, that is super helpful for us. And then I'll end it in just a minute. Uh, okay, we've got one question you may or may not have thoughts about. Someone told me once to mix dirt with animal horns for good microbe production. Have you heard of this?
Mix dirt with animal
Horns.
horns.
I'm kind of wondering if they're talking about the biodynamic practice when you put soil in the cow horn and bury it,
Yeah,
or
I
manure in the
don't,
cow horn and
I'm
bury
not
it.
familiar with the practice of why they do that.
We
Um,
can leave it. It's okay.
yeah, I'm intrigued,
Someone knows.
but I don't know how to answer that question.
That is fair. Um, I have a question then. We don't have any more in the chat right now, so I want to ask, when you're talking about turning the pile, it sounds like you might need some heavy equipment for that, but do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, if it's on a farm where you have, um, multiple animals that you're composting, you'll need some sort of bucket loader tractor that, you don't necessarily need, there's windrow equipment that you pull along with the tractor, and it actually turns the material in place and just kind of turns it over, but leaves it in the same spot. If you don't have that sort of system, you're probably looking at kind of scooping it and dropping it back down using a tractor, just kind of mixing it up in place, or scooping it and dropping it to the side so that you kind of turn the pile in stages as you go down the length of it. But yeah, if you have a significant amount of material, you'll definitely need equipment to manage that in a small compost system at home. Um, if you're just composting food waste, yard waste in your backyard, you probably have a pitchfork of some sort that you kind of can use in there to kind of mix it up and introduce oxygen and kind of start the heating process again. So it really is just dependent on the amount of material that you're dealing with.
I think this is where the emotional piece comes in, right? Because I think about like well, I just before our webinar, I was just telling Amy my cat just died. And we buried her underneath a cucumber bed. And it was actually very painful even to just like put dirt on her body. So I'm thinking, but you just get through it, right? It's like this is how life and death are. But then I'm thinking about the process of like if I would have had to actually turn the compost when her body was partially decomposed. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if I would have been able, I'm not sure about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I'm kind of curious. I would love for people to comment in the chat box or whatever, how you feel about that idea of composting companion animals. Is it one of those where you're like, I really don't like the idea of, cats and dogs or horses being composted? Some people might think that seems like disrespectful to the animal, that it should just be buried or cremated. some people may think, what, that's a great option, but I couldn't do it myself. Um, I'm kind of the type like that's a great option, but I have a dog and I'm pretty sure I couldn't compost him, just because you it's very final and you're seeing it happen in front of you and it's you have that emotional connection. Um, some people may be able to do it themselves. I would not have an issue with doing that with other animals, other people's animals or horses, but my own, then it's a little more difficult. And some people may still just be unsure. So I'm just kind of curious what people think um, of that idea of composting companion animals and whether or not
Yeah.
that's acceptable, I guess, or how you kind of view that.
Someone commented that she composted and kept the horse pelt and tanned the pelt.
Yeah, that's that. Yeah, it's interesting because I know with cattle, a lot of times the hide it doesn't compost the way that the other parts of the body do. So yeah, it's you know, like I said, the last person that called me and asked about horses, I said, well, you can compost it and I could tell you how to build it. And she said, no way. I don't want anything to do with that when it's my own animal, but I think it's a great way to handle it if somebody else would do it. So,
Is there
it's
is there a way
personal.
like could you like this whole turning business, like could you, if you had the space, leave it longer and let it actually, would it compost down to kind of the bones before, like potentially
Yeah.
before you had to turn it?
Yeah. For the most part, when I've been involved with any large animal composting, either horse or like a dairy animal or a mature beef animal. So we're talking, you know, 12, 1,400 pounds or more. We're leaving that in place for a good 6 months. Um, and then when it is turned, there's usually just bones left. And those bones are not going to I mean, most people aren't going to compost long enough for those bones to go away. So collecting the bones out of that and disposing of them either by burial or putting them in a trash receptacle, um, that's acceptable at that point. And then continuing to compost the rest of the organic material in there. But there's often not much to find in there besides bones at that point. So
Well,
I
that's
think
great. I mean, bones aren't as disturbing, are they?
no, they're
It's
not.
like
Um,
not not like rotting flesh. You're like, that
right,
was my
yeah.
cat. I can't
Yeah,
unsee this now.
you would not want to open it up until all of the soft tissue is composted. And if you measured the temperature early on and it's not heating up, you can be pretty sure it's not composting in there. So, you want to see that heating last for several months with a large animal to ensure that it's actually breaking it down.
That changes things. I hope people caught that. It's like, okay, well, that sounds more like something I could do than I realized.
Yeah.
If
And
you're
the
kind of
smaller
not
the
turning it to
animal,
later.
poultry in that, you usually don't find the bones of poultry. I mean, they're smaller. They tend to break down more quickly. Um, just the larger the animal, the slower that process becomes.
Yeah. Uh, so if I'm understanding that right, it's like you're not really turning it, like you might really not see anything horrifying when you're turning it.
You shouldn't. You shouldn't.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Um, I've had I've had compost piles before that, I was doing some studies with pigs and they weren't composting the way they should. I knew it wasn't heating up, so I had to kind of break them down and rebuild the piles. Not a pleasant experience at all. Uh, um,
No.
I- my student that was working for me, I don't know how many times I told her, if this is too much for you, you don't have to help me, but she did. But I mean, I guess that just goes to show like this is something I work with a lot, and I didn't get it right the first time with this particular compost design, and we had to rebuild it and introduce some more carbon material into it to make sure we got that heating that we were looking for. So yeah.
Hmm. It looks like we don't have any more questions. Do you have anything you want to say in conclusion, Amy?
I just, if folks want to reach out if they have comments or questions, my email address is up there. Um, Happy to, talk more or give more technical information if folks want that. In fact, I was talking to someone today who's a meat processor and they're composting offal, so the bones and the leftover parts of the animals after they process, and they're doing a good job, but they're interested in improving the process. So we're going to just talk through some ways they can do that. So again, if it's an organic material, it can be composted, but it takes some, I guess, focus and dedication to making sure that system works correctly.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of this. I feel like you really demystified it. Like I would have never felt like I could, compost a flock of chickens that died. And now I'm kind of like, okay, I see how that could happen.
Yeah.
So I'm sure other people, will feel the same or feel the same. So, yeah, and thank you so much for making all this available. And for all of you can see in this slide, like mostly you work with manure, but then you got into this. So like go to Dr. Amy for your manure composting needs as well.
Yeah, manure is where it all started, but then any byproducts, and we have feed that is spoiled or crop residue that's in a flood and it's got mold. Those All of those things usually come to me as how do we compost this and get rid of it. So like I say, if it's organic, we've probably dealt with how to compost and dispose of it.
I love it. I mean, yeah, there's no waste in nature. It's so great.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Composting and using manure in cropping systems is kind of our nature's original recycling process, and
Mm.
uh, it's good. It's good for nature.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amy, and thank you to all of you who are coming, and to all of you who are, watching the recording later. So this will live on our Conservation Nebraska YouTube channel, so you can access that. And yeah, thanks so much for attending the webinar. And was there anything else I needed to say? No, I don't think so. Feel free to reach out to any of us, though. And thank you all so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.